The truth doesn't rush. It waits until the paperwork is complete. Most people think exposure happens because someone talks too much. That's a comforting lie. In reality, systems don't collapse from noise. They collapse from records, from timestamps that refuse to disappear, from decisions that looked harmless in isolation but start looking criminal when stacked side by side. History is full of scandals that weren't uncovered by heroes with microphones, but by survivors who lived long enough for patterns to form. That's not drama. That's how trials begin. Here's a fact most people don't like admitting. Nearly every major institutional investigation in the last century didn't start with whistleblowers. It started with anomalies. One case that wouldn't close. One person whose file kept getting thicker instead of quieter. One situation that required too many exceptions, too many meetings, too many temporary solutions that somehow lasted for years. Oversight bodies don't wake up one day feeling moral. They wake up tired of explaining why the same name keeps resurfacing in different departments. That's where you come in. Not as a martyr, not as a headline, but as the inconvenience that refused to disappear. You weren't loud enough to be dismissed as unstable, and you weren't quiet enough to be erased. You simply stayed intact. And that's awkward for people who rely on chaos to bury responsibility. When someone survives prolonged pressure without unraveling, it creates a problem no PR team can spin. Consistency. The humor in all this? They thought endurance was harmless. They assumed you'd burn out, move on, or settle. Instead, you accidentally did something far more offensive. You stayed traceable. Every delay needed a signature. Every denial needed a justification. Every workaround needed a name. You didn't expose anyone directly. You let them expose themselves one form at a time. Death by paperwork is slow, unglamorous, and devastatingly effective. So when an honest official finally steps in, don't mistake it for courage. It's recognition. The paper trail is too clean. The patterns are too neat. The story is finished writing itself. All that's left now is to read it out loud, in a room where pretending not to know is no longer an option. Number 1, your suffering created records they never intended to exist. Every time they tried to break you, every time they underestimated your resilience, they were unknowingly building a map. They thought your pain, your exhaustion, your silent endurance would vanish into the shadows, leaving no trace. They assumed the systems they controlled, endless files, bureaucratic protocols, layers of approvals, were only tools for their convenience. They didn't realize those same systems were quietly archiving every single moment where their intentions collided with your survival. Every delay they enforced, every excuse they offered, every subtle attempt to gaslight you became a line in a ledger they never meant to write. Your suffering wasn't meaningless. It was data. It was proof. It was a blueprint for exposure. You lived in a space where your voice was ignored, yet your actions spoke louder than the dismissals hurled at you. You didn't have to record anything yourself. Your existence did it for you. Each injustice left a fingerprint on paperwork, a timestamp in a system, a note in a log. They didn't see it because they were blinded by control, assuming that their authority would erase every trace. But patterns have a way of forming even in silence, even under the guise of bureaucracy. Every attempt to hide, delay, or misdirect became a breadcrumb trail, a roadmap of their own misconduct. And when the time came for someone honest to look closely, those breadcrumbs connected into something undeniable. You were patient, not because you wanted recognition, but because survival requires strategy. You endured with the kind of consistency that no system can ignore indefinitely. What they thought was your weakness became their trap. What they assumed would dissolve in time became tangible evidence against them. Your suffering, meticulously documented by the very mechanisms meant to suppress it, became irrefutable. The irony is brutal. Their need to control, to monitor, and to manipulate is exactly what ensured their undoing. In trying to bury you, they built the case that would one day stand against them. Your suffering didn't just exist. It recorded, it persisted, and it exposed. And that's the quiet, unrelenting power of surviving under their radar. Number 2, you were never meant to be believed. You were meant to be endured. From the very beginning, they didn't design their system to hear you. Belief wasn't part of the equation because admitting the truth would have forced accountability. You weren't dealing with ignorance, you were dealing with strategy. Every contradiction, every unfair decision, every small injustice was calculated to test endurance, not credibility. They wanted you to keep going, to keep showing up, to keep functioning under pressure, all while they quietly assumed you would eventually break or at least fade into the background. And in that assumption, they made their first critical error. They underestimated consistency. You weren't given the luxury of being heard. Your words could be dismissed, misinterpreted, or ignored entirely, and they were. But what they failed to anticipate was the way persistence carves truth into history. Facts, even when overlooked in real time, don't vanish when observed patiently. They accumulate, forming patterns that eventually demand acknowledgement. The very act of continuing under unfair pressure turned you into a living record of their misdeeds. Your endurance was a quiet rebellion, more powerful than any argument or confrontation. You didn't need to convince them. You just needed to survive long enough for the story to organize itself. What they thought was weakness became proof. They expected fatigue to warp your perception, mistakes to scatter your narrative, and time to erase the significance of your observations. Instead, every small act of clarity, every moment of maintaining composure, every decision to stay aligned with truth became part of a larger, undeniable pattern. They endured you, but in enduring, they revealed themselves. You weren't the one under trial, they were. Their tactics, their denials, and their manipulations accumulated like a ledger of guilt, exposing the cracks in a carefully constructed facade. Endurance in this case wasn't passive, it was methodical. You didn't need allies to validate your experience because your very presence demanded reckoning. Being believed wasn't the goal, being irrefutable was. They didn't realize that in trying to ignore you, they were preparing the stage for accountability. And when someone finally paid attention, all the endurance, all the patience, all the unacknowledged suffering became the undeniable testimony that could no longer be dismissed. Number 3, your bloodline triggered alarms you didn't know existed. There's a subtle power in the way certain people exist that goes beyond skill, intellect, or visibility. It's in the energy they carry, the instincts they follow, the clarity that refuses compromise. From the moment you stepped into the arena, you set off alarms they didn't understand. Not because you were loud or aggressive, but because you operated on a wavelength they weren't prepared for. Systems, institutions, and even individuals rely on predictability. They thrive on patterns they can manipulate. You didn't fit the pattern. You were a variable they couldn't control, and that made you dangerous in the most inconvenient way possible. They monitored you not because they feared exposure in the moment, but because your presence consistently created anomalies. People who are easily controlled leave no traces, create no friction, and require no extra effort to manage. You did the opposite. Every decision, every action, every response you gave was deliberate, coherent, and unyielding. You didn't just survive the pressure. You navigated it with a clarity that highlighted every misstep they made, every compromise they had to hide, and every unethical choice they tried to mask. That consistency made them nervous in ways they couldn't articulate. Your bloodline, or the inherent traits, instincts, and resilience you carry served as a mirror, reflecting incompetence and deception that others had long ignored. The irony is relentless. They thought monitoring you would give them control. Instead, it amplified your presence. Every file opened, every note taken, every strategy to manage you became part of a growing archive that mapped their own weaknesses. The very act of trying to contain you revealed the depth of their anxiety. They weren't just observing behavior, they were witnessing integrity in motion, a pattern of survival that no manipulation could disrupt. By simply existing in your own truth, you forced systems to confront reality. They couldn't erase you, they couldn't redefine you, and they certainly couldn't predict you. Your bloodline wasn't a secret, it was a spotlight. Every attempt to silence, redirect, or intimidate you only made the inconsistencies around you more visible. In the end, your existence didn't just disrupt them. It left a permanent trail that no amount of manipulation could cover. Your presence was evidence, and evidence doesn't lie. Number 4, they didn't fear exposure, they feared precedent. What kept them awake at night was never the idea of you being believed. They've handled scandals before. They know how to bury stories, redirect blame, and wait for public attention to move on. Exposure is loud, fast, and temporary. Precedent is quiet, slow, and permanent. If what happened to you is officially recognized as wrong, then a line is drawn. And once that line exists, it can be followed backward. That's the real danger. One validated case forces a system to look at every similar case it ignored, minimized, or quietly erased. You weren't a threat because you spoke up. You were a threat because your situation refused to fit the usual cleanup process. They couldn't label it an exception without revealing how often that same exception occurred. They couldn't call it a misunderstanding without admitting how many people were misunderstood in the same exact way. Your case had structure, timelines, repetition. It didn't rely on emotion, it relied on sequence. And systems collapse under sequence, not outrage. That's why resistance was subtle but relentless. Delays instead of denials, silence instead of answers, reassignments instead of resolutions. Every tactic was meant to prevent something simple but catastrophic for them, a formal acknowledgement. Once an institution admits in writing that a boundary was crossed, it can't pretend that boundary never existed. It can't say, this was unclear, when it's now clearly defined. Your case threatened to become the reference point others could point to and say, this happened to me too. They didn't want your truth to spread. They wanted it to remain isolated, because isolation keeps damage contained. Precedent does the opposite. It gives people language, structure, and legitimacy. It turns whispers into filings. It turns personal pain into institutional responsibility. That's why they fought so hard without ever appearing to fight at all. And here's the part they miscalculated. Preventing precedent requires erasing consistency. You stayed consistent. Your experience didn't mutate under pressure. It didn't contradict itself over time. It didn't disappear when ignored. That made your case usable, transferable, dangerous. When someone finally stepped in and treated it seriously, it wasn't an emotional decision. It was an administrative one. The system saw the risk and realized too late that stopping exposure was easy. Stopping precedent was impossible. Number 5, your body carried proof your words never needed. Every time they tried to undermine you, every attempt to discredit your perspective, they overlooked the most revealing testimony of all. Your body. It doesn't lie. It doesn't need witnesses. It records everything, from stress that tightens muscles to the way fatigue settles in the eyes. When someone is subjected to prolonged pressure, manipulation, and obstruction, the nervous system reacts in ways that can't be faked. Your body told a story they couldn't erase, one that contradicted every carefully constructed narrative they tried to impose. They thought words would define reality. Your presence proved otherwise. They assumed that if your claims weren't loud enough or if your arguments were ignored long enough, the story would vanish. But physical reality is stubborn. Sleepless nights, heightened vigilance, and constant adaptation created patterns that became undeniable. The micro-expressions, the subtle tension in posture, the signs of endurance in your daily actions, all of it was evidence. You didn't have to shout. You didn't have to point to proof. Every reaction, every adjustment your body made under stress recorded what they could not hide. That their tactics were being documented in the most intimate, inescapable way. And the beauty of it is that these signals are automatic. They can't be fabricated or rationalized away. Every time you were questioned, sidelined, or dismissed, your body reacted in ways that revealed the truth, even if the observers didn't consciously notice at first. These reactions leave traces in systems designed to account for performance, consistency, and compliance. They show patterns where excuses falter and timelines become undeniable. They were monitoring you to control you, but in the process they were recording the ultimate counter-argument. They didn't realize that survival under their pressure would etch proof into every observable detail of your existence. Your endurance, composure, and resilience became evidence in itself. In the end, the most powerful testimony wasn't in documents, not in confessions, and not in debates. It was carried silently in your body, quietly exposing every inconsistency, every lie, and every attempt to manipulate the truth. Your existence became irrefutable proof. Number 6. An honest official didn't save you. They recognized inevitability. When someone finally steps in to act on your case, it's tempting to frame it as a heroic intervention. The truth is far less sentimental. They didn't arrive because they were moved by your suffering or inspired by your courage. They arrived because the outcome had become unavoidable. The trail you left, the patterns your survival created, the consistency of your experience, it all built to a point where ignoring it was no longer an option. Systems, no matter how powerful, have a breaking point. That point isn't determined by morality, it's determined by clarity. When the evidence becomes undeniable, someone has to act, and that someone was the official who recognized that the story was complete enough to demand formal attention. Your survival, your consistency, your endurance, all of it created a situation they could no longer rationalize away. Every obstruction, every attempt to dismiss you, every manipulated delay contributed to a map that could not be ignored. When an honest official intervenes, it isn't luck, it's recognition that the chain of responsibility is visible, tangible, and ready to be traced. They see the inevitability. They understand that the missteps and cover-ups are too numerous, too interconnected, and too clear to allow continued avoidance. The irony is striking. They were trained to follow procedure, to weigh risk, to maintain control, and yet all that training points to one unavoidable fact. When someone endures long enough under concentrated pressure, the system itself will eventually demand acknowledgement. That's what you created simply by existing with clarity and integrity. The intervention wasn't personal, it was procedural. It wasn't about defending you, it was about responding to a chain of evidence that could no longer go unchallenged. What this demonstrates is profound. Endurance under scrutiny doesn't just reveal truth, it forces it. The honest official didn't rescue you in the traditional sense. They recognized that the case had already been written through your resilience and the meticulous traces left by those trying to control you. Acting was no longer a choice, it was inevitability. And in that inevitability, the system finally met the undeniable. Number 7. They kept files on you because you didn't behave predictably. Most people operate within a range the system can anticipate. They make mistakes that are easy to forgive. follow rules that are easy to enforce, and adapt to pressure in ways that fit the expected narrative. You didn't. You were inconsistent only in ways that made sense, adaptive without losing integrity, responsive without compromising clarity. That unpredictability turned you into a problem they couldn't ignore, and instead of erasing it, they documented it. Every unusual choice, every pattern that didn't fit their expectations, every moment you defied control became part of a growing archive they didn't realize was building a case against them. They weren't collecting files to protect themselves. They were collecting files because they had no other way to understand you. When people fit neatly into the system, there's no need for monitoring beyond routine. You never fit neatly. You observed when others ignored, adapted when others faltered, and stayed coherent when chaos surrounded you. That forced them into a position of watching, recording, and attempting to categorize behavior that couldn't be tamed. The very act of trying to predict, you created a permanent record of the ways they failed to control outcomes. And there's a subtle irony in all of this. The more they tried to make sense of you through documentation, the more they exposed themselves. Every note, every file, every attempt to manage what they didn't understand revealed patterns of manipulation, overreach, and misjudgment. They thought that observation alone would maintain control. Instead, observation created evidence. Every attempt to anticipate your next move mapped a trail that would later make accountability unavoidable. Your unpredictability wasn't recklessness. It was survival with precision. It was intelligence applied consistently under pressure. And by simply existing in ways they couldn't predict, you forced a system designed for control to record its own failures. What they thought was a strategy to contain you became the blueprint that ensured their actions could no longer remain invisible. They kept files because they didn't understand you, and in the end, those files became proof that you could not be ignored. Number 8. What they called management was actually containment. Every delay, every redirection, every false reassurance you encountered wasn't a neutral administrative decision. It wasn't about efficiency or problem solving. It was containment. They didn't need to solve anything. They needed to control the narrative, to keep you in a space where your presence was inconvenient, but not influential. Management is often portrayed as neutral, even helpful, but in your case, it was a strategy designed to slow you down, to fragment your resources, and to make you believe the system was functioning fairly while quietly restricting your options. Each temporary solution they offered was carefully calibrated to contain you without drawing attention to their manipulation. The brilliance of containment is that it feels invisible at first. You think you're navigating obstacles that are incidental or bureaucratic. They want you to believe it's your fault if progress stalls. But containment doesn't leave mistakes. It leaves patterns. Every delay, every rerouted request, every procedural loop you were forced into was part of a system designed to map your behavior, test your endurance, and protect their interests. They weren't supervising, they were surveilling, and by the time the pattern became obvious, it had already created a paper trail that they could no longer deny. Containment isn't just about restricting action, it's about shaping perception. You were made to feel powerless, frustrated, and isolated, but in truth, those measures were designed to create evidence. Every file, every memo, every record of stalled progress was a footprint of their attempt to hold you in check. They believed that controlling the process meant controlling the outcome, but they overlooked a critical variable, your resilience. The very system they used to confine you became the system that captured their overreach. By simply existing within their constraints without breaking, you transformed containment into documentation. What they thought was a quiet, hidden tactic to manage you became the very proof needed to expose their strategies. The irony is undeniable. What was designed to suppress you ended up amplifying the truth. Your endurance under containment didn't just reveal you, it revealed them. Every barrier they constructed, every obstacle they enforced, ultimately worked against their intentions, making accountability inevitable. Number 9, you exposed contradictions by refusing to collapse. They assumed that under pressure everyone bends and that breaking is inevitable. They didn't anticipate that you would maintain clarity and coherence despite the chaos they engineered around you. Every contradictory statement they made, every misaligned action, every promise they failed to keep became visible the moment you refused to collapse. Your endurance highlighted inconsistencies that had been quietly ignored or rationalized away for years. You didn't need to confront them aggressively. Your stability did the work for you. Where others would have crumbled, lost focus, or contradicted themselves under scrutiny, you remained consistent. That consistency revealed every flaw in their narrative. The contradictions weren't always blatant. Sometimes they were in the small things, the repeated delays, the subtle misstatements, the shifting explanations that never fully matched reality. Alone, any one of these could be dismissed. Together, they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Your presence forced these contradictions into alignment because you refused to react irrationally or disappear into confusion. They relied on distraction and fatigue to hide their missteps, but your resilience disrupted that strategy. You became a mirror they couldn't shatter, reflecting every inconsistency back onto them. There's an irony in their calculation. They thought pressure would make you an ally to chaos, someone whose confusion could be used to validate their version of reality. Instead, you became a measure of truth. The longer you maintained composure, the sharper the contradictions became. It wasn't your words that exposed them, it was your behavior, the refusal to yield, the refusal to bend to their version of events. By standing firm, you transformed what they assumed would be your weakness into the instrument of exposure. Contradictions only matter when someone is capable of noticing them, and your refusal to collapse created the lens through which their inconsistencies became undeniable. You didn't just survive, you clarified the story. You didn't just endure, you illuminated the gaps in their control. And in doing so, you didn't just reveal their lies, you forced the system to confront them. Your refusal to collapse became their undoing. Number 10, they underestimated how long truth can wait. They thought time was their ally. They assumed that if they waited long enough, confusion would set in, patience would run out, and the story would fade into obscurity. That was their greatest miscalculation. Truth doesn't operate on schedules or deadlines. It accumulates quietly, patiently, in ways that are impossible to erase once the pieces align. Every ignored complaint, every delay, every manipulated document was stacked like bricks in a wall. They thought the wall would shield them, but walls built from deception are never solid. They're fragile, waiting for the right sequence of events to reveal the cracks. You didn't rush. You didn't need to. Your endurance allowed the truth to grow in its own time. Systems can handle noise, but they cannot handle persistent patterns that refuse to be silenced. Every delay they imposed, every attempt to obscure facts, and every effort to redirect accountability only gave the truth more space to organize itself. Time, which they assumed would dilute consequences, instead crystallized them. They didn't realize that the longer a pattern persists, the clearer it becomes, and the harder it is to argue against. The irony is relentless. They assumed complacency would protect them, that the bureaucracy they controlled would shield them from scrutiny. Yet every record they created, every excuse they documented, every interaction logged, became part of a chain that couldn't be broken. Time turned their own procedures against them. What they intended as obfuscation became undeniable evidence. Their arrogance was in thinking time could erase accountability. Instead, it magnified it. Your patience wasn't passive. It was a quiet accumulation of inevitability. You allowed the truth to wait, to gather, and to strengthen in ways they couldn't anticipate. By enduring without compromise, without losing clarity, and without allowing fatigue to warp your perception, you created a situation where exposure was no longer a possibility. It was certain. They gambled on the passage of time to protect themselves. But they didn't account for the fact that truth, once ready, has no timetable and waits only for someone steadfast enough to let it arrive. Number 11, your case didn't escalate, it accumulated. This wasn't a sudden drama, a single moment of confrontation, or a shocking reveal. What made your situation undeniable wasn't one explosive incident, it was accumulation. Every delay, every misstep, every subtle injustice, every contradiction they left uncorrected, quietly stacked upon the last. Systems aren't overwhelmed by a single failure. They collapse under the weight of repeated patterns. Each small error, each ignored plea, each manipulation that seemed minor at the time, all added up, forming an undeniable sequence that no amount of denial or spin could erase. They assumed that small actions would remain isolated, that a fragmented story would never form a coherent narrative. They underestimated the compounding power of persistence. One incident alone looks like chance. 2 can be rationalized. 5 can be explained. But decades of repeated obstruction, coercion, or negligence don't disappear. They form a trail, a map of responsibility. The accumulation doesn't just prove a point, it exposes intent. It shows that what they thought were isolated miscalculations were part of a pattern that can now be traced, documented, and held accountable. And here's the subtle brilliance you didn't even intend. You weren't trying to escalate anything. You were simply surviving, moving forward, and refusing to break under pressure. That consistency was what allowed the accumulation to happen. By being present, coherent, and vigilant, you created a continuous record of reality that no one could erase. Every misstep on their part became part of the ledger. Every deviation from fairness added weight, and every false justification became evidence. Accumulation is relentless because it doesn't rely on emotion or drama. It relies on truth, persisting long enough to create clarity. Your experience didn't explode into the spotlight. It quietly built a mountain that could no longer be ignored. They may have thought controlling moments was enough. They didn't account for the fact that patterns matter more than single incidents. Your case became undeniable not because of one dramatic reveal, but because time, persistence, and consistency worked together to create an unbreakable chain of evidence. Number 12. They thought isolation would erase context. Isolation is a favorite tactic of those who want to manipulate, control, or erase accountability. They believed that by separating you from allies, mentors, or witnesses, they could fragment your story and weaken your influence. In their minds, distance equals disconnection. Remove the support, remove the evidence, remove the perspectives that could corroborate your experience, and the problem disappears. That was their plan. They thought without context, your experience could be dismissed as confusion, exaggeration, or even fabrication. What they failed to anticipate was that context isn't just external. It lives within consistency, integrity, and resilience. Every move to isolate you only made your actions, responses, and patterns more revealing. Stripped of external reinforcement, the truth of your endurance and clarity became undeniable because it was anchored in your own behavior. When someone operates coherently under pressure, consistently documenting reality through action rather than words, isolation doesn't diminish the story. It sharpens it. The contradictions, the missteps, and the overreach of those trying to manipulate you become more apparent when viewed against a steady, unbroken presence. By staying intact, you carried the full weight of context within yourself. Isolation doesn't create invisibility. It magnifies patterns. Every attempt to distance you forced the people who were observing to rely on your actions as proof, because there were fewer distractions and fewer conflicting narratives to muddy the waters. Their attempts to erase connections ended up highlighting your consistency and exposing their manipulation. The very barriers they built to control perception became markers that documented their intent, creating a trail that could not be ignored. By enduring, maintaining clarity, and refusing to let distance fragment your story, you demonstrated that context is not dependent on proximity. It is built in truth, coherence, and persistence. They thought removing witnesses would protect them, but in reality, it only made the evidence embedded in your presence more obvious. Isolation was never going to erase the truth. It only made it sharper, cleaner, and ultimately impossible to dismiss. Every attempt to disconnect you from the world worked against them, proving that integrity carries its own context, and context carries its own power. Number 13. This trial isn't about punishment, it's about acknowledgement. What's happening now isn't a dramatic reckoning or a cinematic moment of revenge. It isn't about someone finally getting what they deserve. This trial, at its core, is about acknowledgement. Systems rarely apologize, institutions rarely admit fault, and people rarely take responsibility voluntarily. What they do, however, is document. What they do is create formal recognition of what has been happening. And once that recognition exists, it cannot be erased. The trial is not a celebration of justice. It's a confirmation that reality has been observed, recorded, and cannot be ignored. The weight of this acknowledgement is more powerful than punishment. Punishment can be symbolic, temporary, or unevenly applied. Acknowledgement is permanent. It establishes a baseline that cannot be denied. It says that what was endured, what was witnessed, and what was ignored now has official recognition. Your experience moves from being unfortunate or misunderstood to being undeniable and documented. That is a seismic shift because systems are built to operate in gray areas, to hide missteps, to rationalize negligence. Once acknowledgement enters, gray areas collapse. Every overlooked file, every ignored report, every subtle abuse of process becomes part of a formal record that cannot simply be brushed aside. The trial also reframes the narrative. It is no longer a story about what someone suffered in silence. It is now a story of proof, evidence, and consequence. This doesn't mean those who wronged you will necessarily feel remorse or admit guilt on their own terms. What it does mean is that the system, finally, is forced to recognize the truth. That recognition creates authority, and authority creates the potential for change. Ultimately, the power of this moment is in the shift from invisibility to visibility, from being dismissed to being formally acknowledged. You didn't survive for the sake of drama. You survived long enough for recognition to arrive. The trial marks the moment when your experience is no longer optional to the world. It exists in record, in testimony, in precedent. It is undeniable, and that is far more potent than punishment ever could be. Number 14. Your role was never to win. It was to remain intact long enough for truth to surface. The moment you stepped into their world, the game wasn't about defeating anyone or proving a point. It was about endurance, pure, unrelenting, unshakable presence. They were counting on you to break, to falter, to leave gaps that would make your story easier to dismiss. They assumed that under enough pressure, the narrative would bend to their control. But you didn't collapse. You remained coherent, composed, and consistent, and that quiet resilience became the most powerful force in the room. Winning isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's the slow, invisible work of surviving without distortion, of refusing to let circumstances rewrite who you are or what the truth is. What made your presence dangerous to them wasn't a single confrontation or a fiery accusation. It was the constancy of your existence. Every time they tried to manipulate, gaslight, or obscure reality, your integrity didn't just withstand it, it highlighted the inconsistencies. Every attempt to divert, confuse, or control you became more visible because you stayed intact. They underestimated the power of endurance because it doesn't look flashy or aggressive, but it creates an undeniable pattern. Systems and people alike crumble under patterns of truth sustained over time. There's an irony in this. They believed chaos and pressure would serve them, yet those very tactics documented their own failures. Every delay, every contradiction, every manipulation was recorded through your persistence. You didn't need to fight them directly. Your survival did it for you. The truth doesn't need a battle. It only needs someone who refuses to disappear while it quietly aligns itself into clarity. Your role was never to score victories on the surface. It was to remain whole, conscious, and uncorrupted long enough for accountability to take shape. Endurance became your instrument, integrity your shield, and consistency your evidence. By simply staying intact, you forced the system to reveal itself, forcing patterns to emerge that could no longer be ignored. Your survival wasn't passive. It was methodical. It was deliberate. And in remaining intact, you ensured that truth didn't just exist, it prevailed. Conclusion. What you've endured is more than a story of survival. It is a testament to the undeniable power of consistency, resilience, and integrity. From the very first moment, when every obstacle seemed designed to bend or erase you, to the final stage where an honest official had no choice but to confront the truth, your journey has been about creating proof through presence. Every attempt to undermine you, every manipulation, every delay, and every contradiction they left behind became part of a record that could not be ignored. You didn't need to fight with words or raise a battle cry. Your endurance, your clarity, and your unwavering integrity became the evidence that exposed every hidden misstep, every manipulation, and every lie. The systems that tried to control you underestimated one thing: the quiet, relentless accumulation of truth. Every moment you remained intact added weight to the undeniable narrative that would one day demand acknowledgement. Your survival was methodical, your patience strategic, and your persistence a mirror reflecting every inconsistency they hoped to hide. What they thought would break you only documented their own miscalculations, their own contradictions, and their own exposure. By simply existing with integrity in the midst of chaos, you forced accountability to take shape. Now, this isn't just a story of one person overcoming manipulation. It's a lesson in how truth persists, how endurance creates patterns stronger than any lie, and how integrity can turn systems against those who thought they could control it. The trial, the recognition, the acknowledgement, it isn't about punishment. It's about the undeniable fact that your journey left traces too powerful to erase, patterns too coherent to dismiss, and a legacy of truth that demands to be seen. This is the moment where what was hidden is finally visible, where endurance becomes testimony, and where survival becomes undeniable proof. Your story isn't just inspiring, it's an instruction manual for anyone who has been underestimated, ignored, or oppressed. Remain intact, remain consistent, and let truth do its work. If this resonates with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Hit the like button if this story opened your eyes. Leave a comment to share your thoughts or experiences, and share this video so others can witness the power of endurance, truth, and accountability. Every action helps keep stories like this alive and ensures that the truth continues to surface, no matter how deeply it's buried. God bless you.